Welcome back to my Fireside Chats. This week, I want to call your attention to a case out of New Mexico, where a federal judge declared that one of the Otero County commissioners was ineligible to continue holding office based on his participation in the January 6th insurrection. Now, there is a lot of really interesting information in the judge's decision, and I will leave you guys a link to the decision in the video description below. That way you guys can read it in its entirety. However, there's one particular part of it that I want to bring to your attention, which is the judge's definition of an insurrection, as I think it's actually really interesting. Now, before we get into that, we do need to address the law at issue here, which is Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. This section states that any person who engages in insurrection or rebellion against the United States or gives aid and comfort to those doing so is barred from holding any federal or state office. So, if you participate in an insurrection, you can no longer hold federal office, and that was the judge's decision in this case. However, the way the judge describes an insurrection and defines it is really quite ingenious, and I really think it's an accurate representation of what the people who wrote the 14th Amendment were thinking of. He defines it as an assemblage of persons acting to prevent the execution of one or more federal laws for a public purpose through the use of violence, force, or intimidation by numbers. Now, the judge goes on to describe a couple of examples of this, including the whiskey insurrection and Fry's insurrection from early American history, which would have been present in the minds of those people writing the 14th Amendment. In both of these cases, groups of armed Americans rallied together to prevent the implementation of one of their least favorite types of laws, a new tax. Now, in the case of the whiskey insurrection, groups of armed farmers actually engaged in a sizable amount of violence, and President George Washington was forced to federalize several state militia in order to put down the insurrection. However, in the case of Fry's insurrection, things remained relatively peaceful. Instead of resorting to violence, Fry and his followers simply amassed a large group of armed Pennsylvania farmers and essentially dared the tax collectors from the federal government to try and collect the new property tax. The federal government's representatives looked at all of the assembled armed farmers and said, "You know what? No, I don't think we will. Have a nice day." And they left. So we can see that you don't actually have to engage in violence per se to engage in an insurrection, as Fry and his followers were able to use the intimidation and essentially the threat of violence to cause these representatives of the federal government to not enact this new law. Now, when we turn to the events of the 6th, we can see that this definition lines up very nicely, because on the 6th, the laws at issue are the 12th Amendment, the 20th Amendment, and the Electoral Count Act. Obviously, those who gathered there and stormed the Capitol attempted to first intimidate Vice President Pence into rejecting the Electoral College votes through their numbers, and then when that didn't work, they resorted to actual violence, which did actually delay the count by several hours. Now, the other thing that the judge said, which was very interesting in my opinion, was that an insurrection does not care about the truth or the morality of the cause of those engaged in the insurrection. It doesn't matter if you are correct or you are morally justified in what you're doing. Because you are preventing the enactment of a federal law, you are therefore engaged in insurrection. And the example he gives is perfect. It's the Underground Railroad. Now, you might think to yourself, well, they're the good guys. They helped people escape from slavery. What they were doing was a good thing. And I agree with you, it was. However, it was a violation of the Fugitive Slave Act. Those people who were helping slaves escape, instead of returning them to the South where they should have been according to the law, were preventing the enforcement of that law, and oftentimes they did this through not only secrecy, but the use or the threat of violence against those trying to enforce the law. So, despite the justness of their cause, they were still engaged in an insurrection. When we transfer this to January 6th, many of the people who were there had a heartfelt belief that the election had been stolen and that what they were doing was just, and many of them stated that they felt that this was President Trump's orders to go and do this for the good of the country. Now, obviously there isn't any evidence of voter fraud, and these people were deceived, but that doesn't change the fact that their beliefs were very heartfelt, and it compelled them to do this thing. But when it comes to deciding did they engage in insurrection or not, that heartfelt belief isn't relevant before the law. So, again, January 6th was certainly an insurrection. the judge then goes on to lay out all of the evidence in the case, which you can read on your own time. However, the short version is that our defendant gave a bunch of speeches to rally people to attend the events of the day, and then physically stormed the Capitol himself. Pretty cut and dry. However, he's not the first person to be sued under this law. Representatives Madison Cawthorn and Marjorie Taylor Greene were both sued in a similar fashion to prevent them from being on the 2022 ballots. However, both of the cases against them failed. So, the question is, why did they fail, and does this judge's definition of an insurrection help us to understand why? And I think it does. So, in the case of our defendant who has been removed from office, he gave his speeches, he said, we're going to go in, we're going to stop the steal, all of those things. Marjorie Taylor Greene and Madison Cawthorn definitely said very similar things. However, the difference between the two is that both of them are members of Congress and therefore given some protections under the speech and debate clause for the things that they say in their role as congressmen. Now, you might say, well, they're giving a political speech. They're also representing their constituents by saying, no, my constituents believe that the election was stolen, therefore I am coming to D.C. to tell you all that in fact it was, and that I and my constituents believe that. So, a judge may be willing to extend them some protection under the speech and debate clause. Now, secondly, being in the Capitol. Yes, both the defendant in this case and both of our representatives were physically in the Capitol, and both of them did take steps to disrupt the certification of the election. Our defendant in this case by storming the Capitol, and our two representatives by objecting to the certification of the elections in an attempt to send the matter back to the states. However, again, Marjorie Taylor Greene and Madison Cawthorn are acting within the law in their capacity as representatives in Congress, whereas the defendant in this case is simply storming the Capitol and using both intimidation by numbers and violence to prevent the enaction of the laws associated with certifying the election. So, I think when we break down this definition, it really clearly shows how this can be applied to people who are engaged in the events of January 6th, and who it might actually bar from seeking future elected office. Those people who were members of the federal government who actually engaged in this, they're probably in the clear, just because they were acting in their official capacity that day. Anybody else? If they choose to run for office saying, yes, I was there at January 6th, I did all the things, they might be in trouble. This case is going to be appealed, obviously, but it'll be interesting to see where it goes. Regardless of how it ends, I do think the judge's definition of an insurrection is very good, and I think it's well worth carrying forward as we continue to look at the events of January 6th and how that history is going to play out. Think about it. Thanks for watching. If you want to see more of my content, subscribe to the channel and make sure to hit the bell icon so that you get notified whenever I post new videos. If you want to support me on my other social media platforms, all of the links you need will be in the video description below. If you have any questions about this video or another topic that you'd like me to discuss, leave me a comment and I'll do my best to get you an answer. Thanks again for watching, and have a great day.